I'm going to basically, my presentation is divided in 6 parts. I'm going to start by responding to the question, what is CCO, knowing that, of course, you know, there are, again, it's going to be, in a way, my viewpoint on these questions. The origins of CCO. So here I'm going to try to be as inclusive as possible. Then I'm going to speak about the 3 pillars of CCO. There are going to be soon a special, a kind of forum in MCQ about this, and we are also in the handbook, the upcoming handbook of organizational communication. There will be also a chapter on these 3 pillars of CCO. Then I'm going to present something that Job, Tim, myself, and Tim Clark, Tim Kuhn and Tim Clark worked on, which is what we presented, what we call 6 CCO premises. And then, what is a CCO research question? I'm going to try to answer this question, but I'm going to do it through different illustrations, basically, because, of course, again, there are many ways to ask questions that would be related to CCO, but I'm going to present examples. I think that's the best way to do it. Okay, so what is CCO, basically? CCO, you know, of course, there is the idea of constitution, okay, in CCO, the communicative constitution of organization. So this idea that communication is constitutive of the mode of being and functioning of organization. So constitutive means, you know, that we are taking seriously communication as being constitutive of organizing and of organizations in general. Okay, it doesn't mean that's the only component. We are not, I mean, some people could say that it's only in communication, but we could have hardcore, maybe CCO person, or softcore, I don't know if you can say that, CCO person. But communication generates organizations, actually participate in the generation of organization. And it is through and in communication that organizations emerge, express themselves, and do things. So you see, it's kind of weird. Some people could say, oh, how can organizations express themselves? But yes, for CCO researcher, it's not a problem. You're going to see why, because there is a way to make sense of these statements and even how organizations do things, which seems people could say, well, you're refining the organization by saying that. But no, there are ways to actually say that makes sense from a communicational perspective. So in terms of the origins of CCO, of course, it's completely, there is a part of arbitrariness in what I'm going to present now. But I could certainly say for organizational communication scholars, at least, Chester Barnard is certainly an important reference, okay? He's usually considered by ORCOM scholars as being the grandfather of organizational communication. And as early as in 1938, in his book, The Function of the Executive, he wrote this sentence, which has been taken up over and over. An organization comes into being when, first, there are persons able to communicate with each other. 2, who are willing to contribute to action. 3, to accomplish a common purpose. These elements are necessary and sufficient conditions initially, and they are found in all such organizations. Okay, so for him, it was, you know, not common sense, but it was taken for granted that communication was a kind of essential component for organizing to take place. And what I especially like in Chester Barnard is this idea that authority, which is usually an important, of course, phenomenon or question in any organization, he says the character of authority in organization communication lies in the potentiality of assent of those to whom they are sent. Meaning that for Barnard, even if he didn't really study interaction per se, it was important to take into account that authority is not something that is given. It's something that needs to be recognized. Okay, or maybe he would have said something that needs to be negotiated. Okay. Another precursor is Mary Parker Follett. For many people in management, she's also an important precursor. But for us, I think, whoever us is, I think she's also very interesting because, of course, her viewpoint was more prescriptive. Okay, she was a consultant, so she was trying to defend principles according to which we should manage organizations. But she had this concept of reciprocal adjustment, or what she called circular reaction, which was a way for her to take into account the fact that things should be negotiated in an organization. So again, it's prescriptive. It's not that much descriptive, prescriptive. And she also had this distinction between different forms of authority, which she presented as domination, or different ways to make decisions according to domination, compromise, and integration. And in integration, which was the one she was putting forward, she was speaking in terms of co-construction. We have to co-construct a way to work together and not rely on authoritative statements about I'm the person in charge and you should be silent. She was also speaking about relating, and something that also I found quite interesting about authority. She explicitly says that authority is what the situation requires, meaning that when you should actually take into consideration the situation, and this is a situation that will dictate, so to speak, what needs to be done, and not a person in authority. Okay, we'll see how this sentence can make sense, because you could say, yeah, but what is the situation? It's a problem. Yes, it's a problem, of course, but we have to take that into consideration. The third precursor I would present is Gabriel Tarde, which has been kind of forgotten. For some reason, it was actually, there was a revival of Tarde in the 60s through communication scholars, actually. But, his work was translated in English in the 60s, and a little bit before, so when he was at the beginning of the 20th century. But he was actually Durkheim was actually Tarde's disciple. Okay, so Gabriel Tarde is often considered the grandfather of sociology, and Durkheim is, I guess, the father of sociology. So what is especially interesting for Tarde is that Tarde, when, for example, Bruno Latour today speaks about actor network theory, he says, retrospectively, Tarde was the initiator of this movement also, actor network theory, because for Tarde, there is any configuration is what he called a society. So he was considering, for example, crystals, biological organisms, human societies as being configurations that can be called societies. Maybe that's not the right term, but he had no problem about to speak about in these terms to describe different forms that appear to be organized. He was also a proponent of the bottom-up approach, meaning that, and it's written here, we have to start from the small to understand the big. The only thing is that Tarde didn't really have the methodology to illustrate his viewpoint, and one of Latour's argument is to say that today we have what it takes to illustrate Tarde's ideas. And what I especially like in Tarde also is this idea that there is no harmonizing force. He was against systemic approaches of that time. I'm not saying about today, but at that time, where there was this idea that there was an a priori system that was actually governing how things get done. He was saying there is no such thing. This has to be accomplished. It has to be done. Okay, so now we are not speaking about precursors anymore, but we are speaking about people who are actually still ongoing, publishing and active. I'm speaking, of course, of Karl Weick. Here, everybody knows him, so I won't spend too much time. But for sure, CCO movement has a lot in common with Karl Weick because of his focus on organizing, okay, on action. Maybe, but it will depend maybe on our various ways of conceiving of CCO. But maybe we would be less. Let's say Karl Weick is a psychosociologist, if you will, or socio-psychologist, depending on how you want to put it. So he's not that much. I mean, he's very interested in interaction, but he does not really study a lot in the detail of interaction. Okay, but for example, if you look also at this statement, okay, you will see that he's very wary about the word organization. The word organization is a noun, and it is also a myth. Okay, if you look for an organization, you won't find it. What you will find is that there are events linked together that transpire within concrete walls, and these sequences, their pathway and their timing, are the forms we erroneously make into substances when we talk about an organization. Okay, so he was the first to insist on organizing, but you all know that already. Of course, another important influence for the CCO movement, and here, of course, I'm thinking about Bob McPhee, but also Jim Taylor, and so on, is Anthony Giddens. It goes without saying. Okay, Giddens, we could say, his work can be characterized as a way to reconcile structuralist positions and interpretivist or interactionist position. Okay, it's a way to say, can we take seriously what these two movements are saying, and can we try to reconcile their viewpoints? So what is especially important, I think, with Giddens is this idea of binding, the binding of time-space in social systems. Okay, that's this idea of the durée, as we would say, the capacity of an organization to last. How can we explain that? That would be certainly one of his key contributions. And of course, this idea of duality of structure, where the structure is a medium and outcome of reproduction of social practices, okay, which is both a way, a means, and the end result. And of course, nobody will be surprised by this. Actor network theory is certainly an important influence. Why actor network theory? I would say the performative approach to collective. That is, we are actually, organizations are things that get done. Okay, so there is a really, I mean, here we see the influence of ethnomethodology. Okay, even if, of course, there are people would I mean, ethnomethodology would certainly not recognize themselves in actor network theory, but actor network theories would certainly speak a lot about ethnomethodology as an important influence. Especially where they would disagree with each other would be this idea of human and non-human forms of agency, meaning that if, I mean, Latour, for example, is the person who certainly put forward this idea that we have to recognize what objects are doing in specific settings, because if we forget their contributions, then we have no way to explain what's happening. Okay, so that certainly was an important point that put actor network theory on the map, also creating a lot of controversies, because oftentimes people saying, how do you dare talking about such a thing as non-human agency? Are you saying that humans have no agency? No, they're not saying that for sure, but they are recognizing the contribution, let's put it that way, the contribution of various types of technologies, architectural elements in what's happening. So, and what is also interesting is that there is this kind of, you find that in the word actor network theory, is that there is an actor, but there is also a network. Through the actor, you have a kind of uniformity, okay, something that suddenly can represent, translate, embody a lot of things, but you have also a heterogeneity. That is, you have a plurality, okay? So, for example, there is a lot of influence of William James, who speak about pluriverse, universe, and all that kind of thing. Another important influence, we certainly not forget that, because it influenced actually Jim Taylor a lot, and of course it influenced the Lumenian a lot, which is the idea of autopoiesis of self-organization. We often forget that, and you're going to see that this looks like so heterogeneous influences, but I'm convinced that there is a way to reconcile this heterogeneity, especially because once you are taking into account this idea of performativity, and the fact that it's a bottom-up approach, the fact that organizing is such thing that needs to be made or made up, then of course you start to recognize that, okay, there is such a thing as self-organization, as self-production, okay, because you can, if there is such thing as a system that comes up from our interactions with objects, with other human beings, with text and so on, then we can say that there is a system that produces itself. It makes sense. It might, I mean, they might not recognize what we are saying, but there is a way to translate what they are saying into a CCO perspective, I think. Well, so for example, I especially like that whenever you are forming a group, an organized group, okay, The operations that define how systems or groups are organized and bonded are not determined by the environment, but by the system itself, meaning that because we are co-producing something together, then suddenly we are, so to speak, relying on specific logics of actions, on specific procedures, on specific protocols, rules, and so on, that define who we are, and then suddenly everything that is not defined as who we are becomes perturbation and becomes something that has to be taken into account, but that won't determine what we are. So now, if we have to speak about the 3 pillars of CCO, okay, and it was a terminology that I think Dennis proposed, or is it David, or who knows? And it's good that we have 3 pillars because it's like a stool. You know, if you have 2, it doesn't hold. So now we have 3, thanks to you. So we have, different ways of conceiving of CCO. And the term CCO is actually coming from Bob McPhee, okay, who coined this term in his 2000 Electronic Journal of Communication article, or was it before? No, it was, okay, it was good. So it was a term that he coined to speak about what he considered to be, okay, what we need to have in order to have an organization, okay? We need to have basically what he called 4 communicative flows. We need to first have the question about membership negotiation, how the organization enact and maintain relation to its members through socialization, initiations, the idea of we versus them, what he calls reflexive self-structuring, how the organization enact and maintain relation to itself, meaning through charter, organizational charts, policies, rules, and so on. Activity coordination, that's more about organizing, how the organization enact and maintain relation to its subgroups and processes, integration of interactions and work processes. And finally, in terms of inter-organizational communication, you have institutional positioning, how the organization enact and maintain relation to other organizations through PR, investor relations, labor relations, and so on. So here, basically, you have, according to McPhee, the kind of, when you have these 4 flows, then you can have such a thing as an organization that is actively that is active. And so here it's kind of messy, but we are messy. So we have the Montreal School, that's the 2nd pillar. So here are basically the people who kind of represent the school. It was easy for me, of course, to name them because I know them very well. Basically, where is it coming from? It's coming from partly from an article in a book, the book by Jim in 1993, 2 books he published at that time, but also an article that we co-wrote, but it was Jim, the first author, of course, I can assure you of that in 1994 or 1996 actually, where we were working with this idea of how can we acknowledge basically this idea that organizations are stable and at the same time they are ongoing. Okay, so he came up, I should say, with this idea of textual dimension of conversation and the textual dimension of organization and the conversational dimension of organization. So in textual, you have the iterability, the repetition, and the conversation, you have the eventfulness. This idea that it's always for another next first time, if you will, using Garfinkel's very nice expression. It is always for another next first time that we are performing an organization. So there is always a part of eventfulness in any conversation. It's also, here I'm just basically listing a key concepts, I would say, but I'm certainly forgot some of them. This idea of authoring and authorizing, this idea that authority being such an important concept, how can we explain authority from a communicational perspective? And we would say, through the multiplication of authorships. The more authorships you have, the more authority you have. This idea of presentification, incarnation, materialization, that is suddenly you can take into consideration this idea of representation, what somebody embodies or what something embodies. So meaning suddenly something is not only something, it's also all the things that this thing represents, or all these things that this person represents, or embody, incarnate, or materialize. Textual agencies, this idea that text, which are so important in organizations, are doing things. They are constraining us, even if, of course, they need our participation, because we invoke them, we make them say things, and so on and so forth. This idea of distanciation, also in teleaction. How can we act from a distance when we are in an organization? It's a key concept too. Appropriation, attribution. Again, that's very parallel to this idea of a present figure. How we can appropriate, for example, or attribute agency to an organization or to a group. This performativity of attribution. Spacing, timing. Here we are trying to make connections with this idea of, okay, it's not only teleaction, action from a distance, but also throughout time. Okay, so that's something that Consuelo worked a lot on. And dislocation, ventriloquism, which is something I've been working on recently, and of course, worldview. So, but I won't go back too much on that because some of you might be familiar. And here I have the final pillar that make us stable. It's the Lumanian systems approach. Okay, here again, you know, there might be many. I'm sure there are many others, but that's the people I was able to identify. Well, basically, is that there is, of course, a strong influence of the autopoiesis, but there are also some disagreements. Okay, of course, if you read, for example, Maturana today, he tried to disaffiliate himself from some aspects of the Lumanian approach, and the same. It was also true for Luhmann when he was still alive. He was trying to make distinctions, but well, this idea of self-referential systems, it's systems whose main operations consist of demarcating themselves from the rest of the world. Okay, and what is especially important to understand this idea, and it sounds counterintuitive at first sight, and many people resist this idea, of course, but this idea that social systems are not constituted by human beings, but by communications. Okay, so that's what makes Luhmann's approach a CCO approach, because for him that would be maybe the hardcore of CCO, because it's really this idea that he goes as far as saying in a communication theory article that was translated from German, only communication can communicate. Okay, meaning that okay, here it's as though the human beings are kind of perturbations in the system. Okay, and so we have to take into account only the communicative acts, which define, determine, constitute the organizations. And because it's here you see the distinction, it's social versus organizational. For organizational systems, they are characterized by decision communications. So here you can see the influence of March and Simon, for example, on Luhmann, which are, so what characterizes an organization for Luhmann as a system is the fact that the communications that count, if you will, are what he call decision communications. Okay, so now we saw kind of I tried to present, okay, basically the movement, but now, and maybe that's where we might disagree and we might have discussions during this after this presentation, is what does it mean to adopt a CCO approach? Okay, so what kind of epistemological and ontological positioning needs to be adopted to consistently and coherently develop a CCO approach? So here with Tim Kuhn, Job Cornelissen, and Tim Clark, we presented in a special issue. We had an introduction, and we tried to basically lay out these premises because we thought it would be important to try to help people figure out, okay, if I want to adopt this kind of approach, what does it mean in terms of what I have to start from? And knowing that, of course, there is a performative character in what I'm saying. We knew that, of course. first premise, CCO scholarship studies communicational events. It sounds obvious, I could imagine. But you know, it's not that obvious for many people, because we still tend to rely a lot, for example, on interviews. I'm not saying that relying on interviews is bad, but I would really encourage people to actually study. That would be my take. Okay, you can of course disagree, but to actually study conversations, interactions, what is happening in an organization or in organizational settings, in order to illustrate or define or find out some interesting phenomena that would help us figure out what it means to get organized or to do things collectively. So any turn of talk, discourse, artifact, metaphors, architectural element, body, text, or narrative should be considered in its performative or transactional dimension. And if organizations are communicatively constituted, it means that one should examine how what happens in and through communication constitutes, reproduces, or alters organizational forms, whether these are policies, strategies, operations, values, relations, structures. So you see, you have to, for me, that's really the starting point. You have to study communication, of course. Okay. Second premise, we should be as inclusive as possible about what we mean by communication. This, of course, again, this might be controversial, but I think we still tend, and maybe it's going to be interesting with Jop's workshop, actually, to see that, of course, we should not reduce everything to verbal communication. And I'm actually guilty of doing that myself. So, but embodiment means precisely that there are many things that participate in this production. So not only, of course, non-humans that actually we are actually ventriloquizing, if you will, or you are actually mobilizing in the discussion, you are reacting to, but also through your gesture, through your attitude, through how you basically your body movement, your composure, and so on. So organizational values, knowledges, or ideology can be communicated, incarnated, and constituted not only through what people say and write, but also through what they wear, look like, and behave themselves. Okay, and of course, this is something that is not only, this would be an interesting ethnomethodological question. Of course, we would have to see how people, okay, negotiate this aspect. It's not only through the gaze or the observation of the analyst, but the analyst has to recognize how this is acknowledged by the people who are co-producing these effects. Okay, so basically you have the idea here. Third premise, CCO scholarship acknowledges the co-constructed and co-oriented nature of organizational communication. Too often we, and again, that's something that ethnomethodology teaches us, I think, is there is this idea of co-orientation, co-production, and we tend to forget that. And that's a problem with the performative viewpoint, is that, okay, we speak in terms of performativity, but how is it recognized? Okay, because maybe my embodiment might not be recognized. What I'm invoking a rule, I'm invoking something that basically is not acknowledged at all, and this does not work. Premise 4, CCO scholarship holds that who or what is acting always is an open question. So speaking or acting in the name of strategies, visions, or missions amounts to positioning these figures as participating in the definition of organizational situation. What I mean here is that, again, because of this idea of representation, embodiment, what or who is acting is not defined a priori, if you will. Okay, it's something that needs to be negotiated. Premise 5, CCO scholarship never leaves the real or communicational events. Okay, we have to remain on the terra firma of interaction, if you will. And premise 6, CCO scholarship favors neither organizing nor organization. So that's where we would differ from maybe Weick. Okay, that we are taking into account both ideas. Okay, so now what is a CCO research question? I think that no specific methodology should be privileged as long as the object of study is communication. So network analysis, conversational analysis, structurationist approach that would, for example, use network or use content analysis or use conversational analysis like Deirdre Bowden did in her 1994 book. So there is no specific methodology that is privileged. And in terms of objects of study, I try to list them here, you know, interactions, text, behaviors, artifacts, architectural elements. I think it's really open, okay, in terms of what can be studied. For example, there was something very nice that Tim Kuhn and one of his students recently wrote about, you know, how architectural elements communicate. And these studies, I think, must be grounded in action, in communication again. And here I'm presenting some effects that we can maybe focus on, effects of translation, of representativeness, of embodiment, okay, that we can possibly focus on. But here I'm going, sorry to put you on the spot, Consuelo, but for me that's how you present you know, a CCO research question. I think it's again through examples, okay? For example, for a dissertation and for a recent article also she published in Communication Theory, she asked the question, how can an organization be here and there at the same time, now and then at the same place? That was her main research question, and she was doing it through this idea of spacing, how, you know, an organization spaces itself, so to speak. But again, through what people are doing, not only people, but also various agents that act on behalf of an organization and how this is recognized or not, okay? So it was for her a way to identify 4 practices that for her represented this idea of spacing and timing. Another by Nicolas, well, the question, how can an organization act? Again, does it make sense to say that? Okay, can it be considered as an actor in itself, or does it need others to act on its behalf? Okay, so here he worked. The whole dissertation is about that, and it's through many different illustrations. He showed, you know, how the attribution of a specific action to an organizational actor is taking place in the conversation. Okay, and how people through different forms of positioning are suddenly speaking on behalf of an organization or speaking as a representative of a group and so on and so forth. And what I especially like in his analysis is that this idea of that organization exists more or less and in a certain way by calling for further actions. It's a very nice analysis where you show that actually the idea of that an organization is acting depends on the number of actors that come to represent it, and it's a question of more or less existing, which is something that we tend to think about existence as something that does not exist or exist, but suddenly we see that with the CCO approach, it's a more of matter of more or less existence. Frédéric Matt, it's about, for example, this question of tension. Frédéric has been studied Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and he worked on the different tensions that these people who are working for this organization are experiencing, but also dealing with in their conversations, in their meetings, and so on. And again, he was able to very nicely show, you know, how these tensions can actually be identified in the conversations between these members. Mathieu Chaput, it was a very interesting also work on this idea of actually the creation of an organization. And we tend to always study organizations where they are, when they have been created and they are ongoing. But actually, Mathieu actually studied and recorded did a very nice video recording and very nice analysis of the founding of an organization. And what was especially interesting is to see how people were trying of negotiating the principles, rules that would define their organizations. And so we'll have actually, so it was a way to reconcile against this kind of structuralist position with this kind of interactionist position. Lisette Maroquin, She studied organizational change. Of course, organizational change it's something that has to be studied from a CCO perspective, because we have to see how organizational change is brought about through interaction. Okay, so I'm going to finish here. Basically, that's you know, I don't know if I really responded to your question, but it was a hard question I thought it would be a good idea to start with a kind of very broad presentation of who we are, if you will, knowing that this is, of course, always an open question, because we believe in performativity by definition. So we know that, you know, it's an accomplishment. So it's an ongoing accomplishment with a lot of controversies to come. Thank you.